Well, the history of China's relations with Latin America and the Caribbean really can be traced back to the Manila Galleon, reliably. That's the 16th century, when a voyage in both directions became possible between Mexico, carrying silver to the Philippines and goods back that were taken from China to the Philippines, and then Manila, the new Spanish colonial city for East Asia, became a hub for goods. But that is very early. Really, when things started to become more interesting was a lot later, in the early 19th century. The Qing Empire, especially people from the south of the country, were encouraged, invited, sometimes shanghaied, forced under certain conditions out of great poverty into labor conditions in Peru, especially for what became known as coolie labor. So initially indentured work, and then there were more and more migrants from China, mainly men, traveling in ships to Peru, Mexico, Panama. In the Panama Canal building, especially when the French started it, that became an important influx of Chinese migrant workers, and they stayed. Those that survived the voyage and the early years of working there created their families, and soon went into the food trade and restaurant trade. That's why Peru especially has a very strong tradition of Asian food. But many other countries in Latin America also saw some Chinese presence. And the result was that in the late Qing Empire, the Zhongli Yamen, the Chinese Qing Imperial Foreign Office, decided to send permanent envoys to Peru and Mexico, precisely to look after these the interests of these expat Chinese and their descendants. Then, more recently, in the 1960s, 70s, after the creation of New China, a handful of countries, starting with Cuba, unsurprisingly, recognized the People's Republic, and there were communist movements growing in Latin America, socialist experiments, some of them inspired by the Maoist movement. And then the important change happened in the 1970s, when country after country recognized the People's Republic of China, no longer recognizing Taiwan, and then it became a continuous exchange, political, cultural exchange. And then only very recently, and this is where it gets exciting for me and for researchers nowadays, since 2004, when Hu Jintao visited Latin America, this became this was the time when China really started to get interested in Latin America as great potential for partnerships for energy security, for food security for their own country. And so there began a continuous exchange, constant visits, and this is when the partnership or the relationship really begins to pick up, and also where the United States started to get a little bit concerned about the Chinese competition, the Chinese presence in the region. There have been several important developments in the last few years. As I mentioned earlier, 2004 is when there was an official turning, sort of facing Latin America from the Chinese central government. And then they began to build up investments, focusing first on strategic partners. They called them strategic partnerships. This is sort of a Chinese designation for prioritizing certain countries, like Venezuela. Venezuela was a very interesting case. It still is, because there was an extremely large number of visits both Hugo Chavez traveled to China 6 times on official visits. Since then, his successor, Nicolás Maduro, has also traveled there several times. Similarly, a Brazil Center was opened in Beijing for the study of Brazil by Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil. So there was a growing exchange of ideas, of flows of money, and of course trade, simply China buying more and more minerals, oil, and in return also loaning money or paying for these goods in advance, so that these economies like Ecuador also could have access to funds from China. So these were basically a number of, maybe not individual events, but tendencies, trends that really picked up speed in a big way, so that China has become over time the first or second largest trading partner for every country in Latin America and the Caribbean, with an interesting caveat that there were, at the beginning of this century, roughly 21 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean that still recognized Taiwan. This has now been whittled down over time to about 9, if I'm not mistaken. So that means that only a very small number of islands and small countries in Central America, plus Paraguay in South America, have still diplomatic partnerships, relationship with Taiwan, whereas the vast majority of countries have recognized Beijing, China, as the sole China they deal with. And this obviously impacts the exchange, the establishment of institutes, the flow of people and goods. Developmental aid is a tricky one because it depends on how you define it. So the Chinese have not been big donors in the sense of giving money through NGOs, perhaps, to developments of social projects, etc. They have, however, emphasized the importance of you could call it the Chinese model of development, like the Xibu Dakaifar, the Great Western Development of China itself, when it tried to integrate and tie central China, the western part of China, into the coastal regions through infrastructure development. And this is something that they want to and have been trying to tie in with their projects strategically in Latin America. So that involves road building, dams, electricity, transmission, and that kind of thing. So there are that kind of developmental aid is perhaps what the Chinese consider the most important. Always centrally presented by Chinese leaders when they visit Latin America is this notion that they need to, the road to development is through connectivity and through inclusion, and this kind of emphasis is important in Chinese investment projects. So developmental aid as such maybe isn't done in the same way. That said, China has also become active in some of the multilateral banks, not only the ones it's created itself, but also, for instance, the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, in Washington, D.C. China has come to play an increasingly important role there, although it has a very small share that it took over from former Yugoslavia, but it has provided huge funds and has several Chinese representatives in the IDB in Washington that oversee funds that flow from China through the IDB into different projects, mainly as loans in Latin America. Let's remember that Latin America, despite all the globalization we've seen, is still the region that is geographically the furthest away from China, and that's not going to change. But China, and also there are oceans either side, so there is no Belt and Road as such. That is very much a Eurasian African project, but China has extended this conceptually by including the maritime Silk Route, referring to the Manila galleon trade that started in the 500 years ago. So this is the sort of thing that the Chinese like to refer to when they incorporate Latin America conceptually in the Belt and Road Initiative. There have been delegations under the BRI umbrella coming to Latin America doing all sorts of proposals, and there has been an effort specifically for the bioceanic connection. Brazil, Peru, connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific, also in the very far south, Patagonia, Chile, Argentina, and China is very interested in getting more involved. Of course, a Hong Kong company, even in the 1990s, Li Ka-shing's Hutchison Whampoa company already was heavily involved, owning several of the container transshipment ports in Panama. So there has been a growing Chinese presence that has been sort of subsumed under the Belt and Road Initiative and the Maritime Silk Route. Formally, China about 3 years ago, invited over 160 countries worldwide to join the Belt and Road Initiative, and 19 out of the 32 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean did in fact sign on to this. But that is more of a memorandum of understanding, a general support. There is no commitment either side. It is a declaration of interest and possible collaboration in the future. So in that sense, Latin America is on the verge of being more involved and is constantly being presented with projects by state-owned enterprises and private enterprises from China to develop infrastructure projects that connect countries, that connect societies within Latin America. We'll see where it all goes. This is also something many are observing. Many want to see what the ownership situation is. There is a worry about indebtedness by the receiver countries of such loans and investment projects. But it's certainly something Latin America desperately needs. So for someone like me who has lived in Latin America for many years, I can see that compared to Europe, for instance, and China, connectivity in Latin America is a huge impediment to real progress. You can't even get goods to port in many parts of the continent. I'm putting together a database. I have been for some time putting together a database following the diplomats who are really involved in transmitting the Chinese message, one could say, to Latin American publics. They are often those who try to convene the Chinese, very diverse Chinese enterprises in different Latin American countries. And what's interesting about the diplomats, and this is something that I was so excited to find, and it's quite easy to follow really at the beginning of it, is how Chinese diplomats are quite strategically moved from country to country. There isn't one pattern, there are many crisscrossing lines, but looking at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China and its Latin American Bureau, and looking also at the Chinese Communist Party's Duiwai Lianluobu, the party's own foreign office, 5th department, is also responsible for Latin America and the Caribbean. And from these two, there is a constant flow, a revolving door, you could say, with the embassies in Latin America. Added to that, there are occasional crossovers between the academic community and the diplomatic corps. So as we follow individual careers, we can see that there are many interesting developments and patterns and a growing expertise, something you obviously don't find almost anywhere else, because Europe has a diversity of languages, Africa has a huge, rich diversity of languages, even if there are a few official European languages that dominate. But Latin America is almost exclusively Spanish, with some Portuguese, of course, and English in the Caribbean. So you have the ease of transferring expertise between the embassies. And this is something that I found very interesting. At the same time, as everywhere, you find exceptions. So while I was living in Colombia, the ambassador who perhaps most transformed the relationship over the last 20, 30 years was Li Nianping, who was previously in Germany and in Switzerland. So you suddenly get outsiders coming in, but in Latin America, that's the exception rather than the rule. So this is the sort of broad tendencies I've observed, and I'm digging deeper, also exploring the different profiles of these ambassadors, some of them having, and consuls as well, some of them being very Twitter happy. There is a lot of talk and a new book out recently about the wolf warriors, the wolf warrior diplomats, but in Latin America generally they range from low to medium profile in their presence, in their presentations, in their outreach to the local populations, but they're trying to sort of create goodwill broadly, not as confrontational as you would find in other parts of the world. And I'm basically trying to give a more complete story about Chinese diplomatic efforts. In the background, scholarship has a very important role because Xi Jinping is reported to have expressed concern that there was not adequate expertise on Latin America in the Chinese diplomatic and scholarly community. And a few diplomats I've spoken to agree with that. They have then branched out and gone to study and then come back into the diplomatic service. So given this concern by Xi Jinping, over the past 5 years, as the Inter-American Dialogue has reported, for instance, over 60 study centers of Latin America and the Caribbean have emerged, have been established across Chinese universities. So they inform policy, they inform the diplomats. They, of course, are creating new knowledge and expertise and their own analysis of Latin American realities. And this is a very exciting process that will continue to define the relationship over the next 2 decades, I'm sure. There are constant challenges, especially considering great power competition in Latin America and other regions of the world. We feel some of it in Europe too, but Latin America is a less cohesive group of countries than, say, Europe, maybe even than Africa. So you have a diversity of loyalties that are being created, and the constant looming presence, the historically strongest influence in the region is, of course, the United States of America. And their great power competition between the US and China that has come to the foreground over the last few years and has no sign of abating is very tangible in Latin America today. So even countries who feel comfortable negotiating with different sides, including the European Union, who sort of balance their trade basket and their political loyalties, there is pressure, especially from the US, to choose sides. And this is something that puts many countries or governments in difficult positions. So this is basically where we see a severe challenge. But even taking the United States out of the equation, we can see that the Chinese presence is a cause for concern for many economies in Latin America. There is a fear of dependency, a renewed dependency on a great power. There is the fear of a reprimarization, so that countries that were hoping, especially before the COVID pandemic, to develop new industries have been reduced again to being primarily raw material suppliers, agricultural goods and minerals to China. which has been paying strong prices. So there are a number of concerns for middle and long-term development of Latin American economies faced with China and China's conditions of China's primary interests. So there is a lot to be observed. The hope is that the expertise that is growing in China will help inform policymakers in Beijing and also the diplomats and the enterprises on the ground to truly engage with China, with Latin American economies, Latin American groups, indigenous groups, marginalized rural communities and so on. And if there can be some integration, if China can in some way be positively involved, then that is a good thing. But I've been teaching courses, and always at the end there is this kind of concern. How do we balance the huge opportunities that China presents for Latin America and the challenges in environmental, in social development, and in sort of economic independence terms? So we have to keep observing, and maybe to make it even more interesting from the European point of view, it's not just two very far away parts of the world dealing with each other. There is often direct competition with European interests, be it in commodities, be it in the supply of lithium for batteries, be it in infrastructure projects that, say, a Swiss company might want to build versus a Chinese company, not to mention Japanese and others. So there are constantly conflicting interests, and China is a very powerful player, and the more it is informed, the more it has presence on the ground, the more there will be at least some vying for interests and influence.